So say every other country on this list dumped their leftover guns into one single garage. That garage would still be smaller than what America keeps on its own. The US has about 120.5 civilian-owned firearms for every 100 people, nearly double the next country on Earth. And once you factor in the buying surge from 2020 to 2022, the real number climbs closer to 500 million guns total, or about 1.5 per person, including kids. Americans make up less than 5% of the world's population, but hold somewhere close to 45% of every privately owned gun on the planet. Part of that comes down to the Second Amendment, one of only 3 countries on Earth that treats gun ownership as a constitutional right. But the laws inside the country are their own patchwork. Massachusetts sits at 3.7 firearm deaths per 100,000 people, while Mississippi sits above 25. Same country, completely different reality depending on which state line you cross. Mass shootings at schools, churches, and public spaces have become a recurring news cycle here in a way that doesn't happen anywhere else on this list, and international coverage of it goes viral abroad, specifically because of how normalized that cycle has become at home. If a stat like that stopped you in your tracks, drop a comment with your home country, because we're about to look at a country with almost the same amount of guns and almost none of the violence. Switzerland basically treats owning a rifle like a form of national service, except you get to keep the evidence in your closet. Every Swiss man gets conscripted around age 18 or 19 and issued a service rifle that stays in his home through his years in the reserves, which is a big reason the country sits somewhere between 27 and 45 guns per 100 people, one of the highest rates in Europe. And yet, the gun homicide rate hovers around 0.2 to 0.7 per 100,000 people, roughly 20 times lower than in America, and mass shootings here are close to non-existent. Researchers have actually pushed back hard on the popular version of this story, though. A 2024 review by Wolfgang Strube and his team argued Switzerland's low violence rate has way more to do with its social stability and low inequality than the guns themselves. And the researchers went out of their way to say this specific model just does not transfer somewhere like the US. Buying a non-militia weapon still means a background check, and a criminal record or documented addiction can get someone denied outright. Even the ammunition is tracked. Every single round sold gets logged. So the real question this section leaves hanging is simple. Is Switzerland proof guns aren't the problem, or proof that guns plus military training plus a stable low inequality society is the actual formula? Israel takes that same high training standard and shows you what happens when a government flips the switch overnight because of an actual threat. Before October 2023, only about 1.5% of Israelis held a civilian firearm license, roughly 170,000 people, even though nearly the entire adult population had already gone through mandatory military service and weapons training. Then, the October 7th Hamas attack happened, and within 24 hours, the government declared an emergency loosening of the rules. The stated goal was to let as many citizens arm themselves as possible. The scale of what followed is wild. Applications jumped from an average of 12,000 a year to somewhere between 260,000 and 280,000 in just the 5 months after the attack, and approvals went from about 100 a day to as many as 3,000 a day. By now, licensed ownership has roughly doubled to nearly 400,000 people. Civilian volunteer security teams exploded too, from about 70 units before the attack to over 900 afterward, with more than 10,000 volunteers. But speed has a real cost. One widely reported case involved a civilian who neutralized an actual attacker only to be mistaken for a threat himself and shot by a reservist in the chaos. Exactly the kind of risk critics warn about when a country arms untrained civilians fast during a crisis. Human rights groups have also pushed back hard, arguing the expansion mostly arms Jewish Israeli civilians while offering Palestinian civilians in the same country no equivalent path at all. Russia flips this entire conversation on its head because the country has one of the lowest civilian gun ownership rates on this list and still one of the highest homicide rates, which is the opposite problem from everything we've covered so far. Only about 12.3 guns exist per 100 Russians, a fraction of America's rate, and the law bans automatic weapons and rifled handguns outright for regular citizens, caps magazines at 10 rounds, and forces new owners to start with a shotgun and wait 5 years before they can even apply for a rifle. Even self-defense law works against gun owners here. Many situations legally require an attempted warning shot first, and Russian courts scrutinize self-defense shootings far more skeptically than courts in the US ever would. After the 2021 Kazan school shooting killed 9 people, Putin ordered the rules tightened even further, raising the purchase age to 21. And here's the part that really sets Russia apart from Israel. Despite the ongoing war in Ukraine, Russia hasn't loosened civilian gun laws at home the way Israel did. Wartime arming there runs almost entirely through official state military channels instead. So Russia proves the flip side of Switzerland completely. Low ownership clearly does not guarantee low violence either. Something is happening here that has nothing to do with the gun count at all. China takes restriction to the most extreme version possible on this entire list, an estimated 3.6 civilian guns per 100 people, meaning practical ownership is close to zero. The current law dates to 1996, but the disarmament itself goes back much further. The Chinese Communist Party began systematically disarming rural militias right after taking power in 1949, specifically to lock down central authority, and that same posture has held for over 70 years since. The few legal exceptions are narrow: licensed hunters in designated rural zones and government-approved sport shooting organizations, all under constant inspection. Penalties for illegal possession or trafficking are brutal, ranging up to the death penalty in serious cases, which is about as harsh a deterrent as exists anywhere on Earth. The result is exactly what you'd expect. Gun crime and mass shootings here are almost non-existent, and polling cited in multiple reports suggests most Chinese citizens actually support the policy rather than resent it, tying it to broader cultural values around social stability. So where Japan, later in this video, restricts guns through deep cultural buy-in, China restricts them through raw state enforcement power. Same outcome, completely different mechanism getting you there. Mexico is like a house with the front door bolted shut and a wide open window around the back. The entire country has exactly one legal gun store open to the public, and it's located on a military base, so legal civilian purchase is basically non-existent in practice. And yet, Mexico still records around 30,000 firearm deaths a year. The reason is the window in the back, somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 guns get trafficked in from the United States every single year, and 70 to 90% of weapons recovered at Mexican crime scenes trace directly back to American sellers. Cartels have been documented using .50 caliber rifles that can't legally be bought in Mexico but can be bought across the border, including in a 2020 assassination attempt on Mexico City's police chief that killed 3 people. Most of it runs through straw purchasing. Someone in Texas or Arizona legally buys a gun and hands it off to a trafficker. And a 2026 investigation found small independent gun shops, not the big chains, supply a disproportionate share of the most dangerous weapons crossing the border. This is still unfolding too. Mexico sued several Arizona gun shops directly in 2022, and in March 2025, Mexican officials argued in front of the U.S. Supreme Court that American gun manufacturers should be held liable for the violence their products fuel south of the border. Brazil is what happens when a country slams the brakes and hits the gas at the same time. Registered civilian gun ownership exploded from under 120,000 people in 2018 to nearly 800,000 by 2023, all thanks to a series of decrees under President Jair Bolsonaro that raised ownership limits from 2 guns to 4 and loosened background rules under the slogan that an armed population can never be enslaved. Then, President Lula took office in 2023 and immediately reversed course, cutting personal ownership limits back down, banning civilian 9mm pistols outright, and requiring documented justification just to keep a gun in the house at all. Here's the twist though. Licensed ownership numbers actually kept climbing anyway, up somewhere between 18 and 25%, between 2022 and 2025 to reach almost 980,000 registered owners, even while new gun purchases themselves dropped by as much as 91% in some categories in a single year. And through all of that whiplash, Brazil's homicide rate barely moved, staying around 47,500 in Bolsonaro's last year in office, which complicates the simple version of this story either direction. There's an uncomfortable wrinkle too. Missing persons reports actually rose about 13% over that same stretch, even as official homicide counts fell. And some researchers suspect that gap might reflect organized crime hiding bodies rather than an actual improvement in safety. Japan is like trying to adopt from the strictest shelter on the planet, except what you're adopting is a hunting rifle. The licensing process here is almost comically thorough. An all-day class, a written exam, a live shooting test requiring 95% accuracy, a mental health evaluation from a licensed doctor, a drug test, and a background check that includes interviews with your own neighbors and employer. Once you actually get the gun, it has to be stored in a separate locked safe from the ammunition, subject to surprise police home inspections, and the whole license has to be renewed from scratch every 3 years. After the 1995 Aum Shinrikyo sarin gas attack, mental health screening got tightened even further, and after a 2008 shooting linked to the Yakuza, background checks got stricter again, a pattern where isolated incidents just make the rules harder rather than sparking any real debate about loosening them. Even Japan's organized crime groups reportedly avoid guns because of how bad it looks for business, which tells you the restriction has soaked into the culture and not just the law. The result speaks for itself. Gun crime here is almost non-existent. Australia's answer to one terrible day was to hand back enough guns to fill a small city's worth of closets. After the 1996 Port Arthur massacre killed 35 people and wounded 23 more, Prime Minister John Howard's government passed the National Firearms Agreement just 12 days later and launched a buyback that removed more than 650,000 civilian firearms, about a fifth of the country's entire estimated arsenal at the time, all funded through a special tax and paid out at market value. Before that law, Australia had actually recorded 13 separate mass shootings in the previous 15 years, killing over 100 people combined, which makes the total stop afterward feel even bigger. Australia has not had a mass shooting on that scale since, but this is one of the most argued over stats in the whole gun debate. Some peer-reviewed research found gun deaths declined at a faster rate after the law passed, from around 3% annually before to 5% annually after, while other researchers, including economist John Lott, argue the buyback had no measurable statistical effect once you account for crime trends that were already falling beforehand. And despite the original buyback, Australia's total registered gun count has actually climbed back past 4 million today, roughly 800,000 more than existed before 1996 in the first place. Every single country on this list had a completely different amount of guns and a completely different set of rules. And the one thing that ties all 9 together is that the ownership number alone told you almost nothing. It was always the state, the culture, and the supply chain around that number deciding what happened next. Next time, we're looking at Yemen, New Zealand, and a country where a single 1996 law banning handguns changed an entire nation's relationship with firearms almost overnight.